in listen-only mode.
Hello, I would like to welcome you to the webinar today with Devora Zack, who's calling in from America. Devora is a nationally recognized expert in the field of leadership and author of People Who Hate Networking. Devora has an MBA herself, so she is coming from your angle today to speak to you. If you'd like to take it off from here. Thank you, Devora.
Hi. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining me. I'm looking forward to spending the next hour with you. And I'm going to be asking you questions and teaching you a lot about networking and learning from you. And as we're proceeding, I want you to think about your networking questions and challenges, and we'll try and get to as many of those as possible. My background is I, as mentioned, have an MBA in leadership development and organizational behavior and general management from Cornell University in the States, and another degree in communication and psychology. And I have certifications in the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator and neurolinguistic programming. And all of this comes together to my field, which is leadership development. My company is called Only Connect Consulting, and this is our 16th year, and we work internationally, helping people with communications, change management, team building. And through the years, one thing that's really come to the surface is the challenge of networking. So my publisher asked me to write a book about networking. And the first question is, why do so many people hate networking? And before we answer that, I'd like to find out from you what you think about networking. Do you hate it? Do you like it? Are you in the middle about it? So if you could answer that poll question, and then we'll find out what you think about networking before we go any further.
Devora, we have 90% of people have voted, 46% of people don't mind networking, 21% dislike networking, and 33% hate it.
Great, thank you. Good combination. Okay, so we'll talk about those differences and also what networking really means. And I have to say, this is a topic we found out after the book came out that it has international appeal. And the book has been translated into 10 languages and is available all over the world. And what we found out is that networking is a challenge for all different kinds of people for different reasons, regardless of whether or not they like it or think they're good at it. So we're going to explore why and how to capitalize on your own strengths to be more effective at networking. So when you think of networking, what do you think networking is? What kinds of words come to mind when you think of networking? If you could answer that question, then we'll go to the next step.
Hi, Devora. So we have people writing in saying what they think of when they think of networking. It can be intimidating, it can be a challenge, and lots of people see it as a means to an end. We've got one or two people saying it's enjoyable. So a varied response.
Super, thank you. And that's very expected, and we'll talk about why in a minute. That's great. Thank you for everyone who answered the question. And I know some of you didn't answer the question because you were thinking about your responses, and we'll talk about you as well. All right. There are two main reasons why people dislike networking. One is that networking is very misunderstood. Many people think that networking, which is also why those of you who said things like it's intimidating or uncomfortable, people think that networking is about working a room, shameless self-promotion, selling yourself, being superficial. In fact, real networking is none of those things. Networking is very misunderstood. Real networking is the art of building and maintaining meaningful connections, one person at a time. It is not about how many business cards you can collect or how you can go up to a group of people and introduce yourself. It is really about building mutually beneficial connections for shared outcomes. So networking is about one-on-one interactions, not how many people you can meet out there. Now, another reason people hate networking, some people hate networking, is simply because they're following the wrong rules. Until my book came out, there's really been one set of rules out there that have been repeated over and over again by these other networking writers and speakers who say, to be a good networker, more is more. You have to get out there as much as possible, go to as many events as possible, collect as many cards as possible, have as much constant contact with others. That works for about 30% of the population. The rest of the population, the other 70% or so, it makes us want to crash and burn. It doesn't work. So what happens is that we are attempting to do something that is out of sync with our true personality, our natural inclination, and we hate it, and so we decide we're bad at it. In fact, if you don't like networking or feel not that great about it, it might be, there's a good chance, it's not because you're not good at it, it's simply because you're following the wrong set of rules. So here's an analogy. Let's say I live in Hawaii, and I write a book about how to find a palm tree. And I say, it's so easy to find a palm tree. Just go outside, walk around for a few minutes, look up, and you'll see a palm tree. And you live in London. So you're like, oh, this is how I found a palm tree, okay? And you read the book carefully, and you go outside, and you walk around for blocks and blocks and blocks, and you don't see a palm tree. And so you think, oh, I'm terrible at finding palm trees, and I hate doing this. That is exactly what's happening for people that aren't strong extroverts, and we'll talk about what that means in a minute, who are attempting to follow advice. It wasn't written for them. There's nothing wrong with the book I wrote on palm trees for people who live in Hawaii, but for people who live in London, it's frustrating and it doesn't work, and they're following the wrong rules, and it's not working for them. Really, the book was never intended for them in the first place. So most networking books and networking presenters are presenting one set of rules. We're going to find out about how different personality styles can network in different ways for success all the way around. What I'd like you to do now is to make two lists, or answer what you think of when you think of the word introvert. When you hear that someone's an introvert, what kind of associations come to mind that you think introverts are, or that you think other people think of when they hear the word introvert? So I'd like you to do that first, please.
Hi, Devora. We've got
Okay,
some
wait, I
quick
don't have the
answers
answers
in.
yet, though. Have you gotten responses?
Yeah, we've got quite a few coming in already. So we've got shy, quiet, dull, insular, don't like to talk to people. Got laid back. We've got negative ones as well. Socially awkward, loser was one of the Lino comments.
Thank you. Those are great. Now, a second list. What do you think of when you hear the word extrovert? What associations come to mind, either that you think of when you hear the word extrovert, or that you think other people think of when they hear that someone's an extrovert?
So conversely, we've got for an extrovert, chatty, smart, outgoing, gains their energy from others, recharges their batteries from others.
Super.
A salesman, chatty and confident.
These are great. I love them. Thank you for everyone who wrote an answer, and for those of you that were thinking about writing an answer but didn't, and again, we'll talk about you too. So, great lists, and quite similar to other responses I've gotten from people who answer these questions, which I love to ask people. Here's what's interesting. Almost nothing that was on those two lists is true about what are the actual differences between introverts and extroverts. They are very typical stereotypes that I hear all the time from people, and almost none of them correlate with the real differences between introverts and extroverts. So there are really three distinctions, just three, however they do make a big difference in how people network and how people interact between introverts and extroverts. The first is Introverts think to talk, and extroverts talk to think. So I'll say that again. Introverts have to think before they speak. They think to talk in order to know what they're going to say. Extroverts talk to think. So in order to know what they're really thinking, extroverts have to talk to work through what they're thinking. It's the opposite. Now, when I said thank you to everybody who responded, and also those of you that were thinking about your response, for introverts, it takes a little bit longer to think through what you're going to write or how you're going to respond. So it's harder to work really quickly on a situation like this and get a response out there. You might have, however, it just generally is you need a little bit more time. So the first difference between introverts and extroverts is introverts think to talk and extroverts talk to think. The second difference is introverts energize alone and extroverts energize with others. So introverts get their energy by being alone, get re-energized, spending time alone, or with one-on-one, somebody they feel very connected to, and extroverts get their energy by socializing, by being around other people. We'll talk about this in a minute. The third difference is introverts go deep and extroverts go wide. So introverts prefer fewer, deeper connections, fewer interests that they go deeper into, less stimuli. Extroverts like a lot of action, a lot of activity, a lot of things going on, a lot of people around. So those are the three only real differences between introverts and extroverts. Introverts think to talk, extroverts talk to think. Introverts energize alone, extroverts energize with others. Introverts go deep, extroverts go wide. Now, those three differences, you might notice, have nothing whatsoever to do with intelligence, energy level, confidence, and a lot of other things that people associate with either introverts or extroverts. Sometimes extroverts can feel shy, sometimes introverts can be outgoing. So it's not what people think, and there's a lot of negative stereotypes of introverts. As it turns out, the general population is about half and half. It's about 50% introverts and 50% extroverts. And in my first book, Networking for People Who Hate Networking, there's a survey, so you can find out exactly where you are along that spectrum. And I've also introduced a new term that we coined called centroverts. And centroverts are people that are pretty much in the middle. So if you're listening to me talk and you're thinking, I don't know, I really can relate to both equally, there's a good chance you're a centrovert. And so people in the middle can relate to both sides, and it does not mean that you're wishy-washy or that you don't have a strong opinion about things. It simply means you can relate to both sides more easily than people on one end of the spectrum or other. Now, sometimes when we talk about people and personality styles, certain people think, well, I don't think we should label people, and people are more complex than that. So if you're thinking that, I want to address it. Of course, people are more complex than that. There's a lot of dimensions to personality. So what we're doing right now is we're breaking down one slice, one sliver of personality that we are going to identify and isolate because it's so linked to networking. And if you can start to understand this in yourself and others, you'll be more effective at networking. Another distinction about that makes people more complicated than being one of three types is what we call strength of preferences. And that means how strongly you identify with being either an introvert or an extrovert. So people who have a strong preference for introversion, almost anything I say or anything you read in my book about introverts you'll relate to. Other people, you're more in the middle, and everyone's on a continuum, and everyone has a little bit of both or a lot of both, depending on where you are. So I wanted to address that as well. Why does this matter in terms of networking? The reason why is because to be an effective networker, the first step is to understand who you are, to get where you are, to understand your personality. The next very important step is to accept who you are and say, okay, this is who I am. I think to talk, or I energize alone. Instead of saying I should be around other people all the time, or I should have a different personality, or I should go to all these events and like them. Say, you know what, this is how I am. How can I maximize my own natural strengths, my own real natural traits to be effective? And I want you to notice that whenever you say to yourself, I should do this, it almost always means the exact opposite, that you shouldn't. So if you're an introvert and you're at a business conference and you think, oh, I should go out with everyone for this big 3-hour dinner and socialize after a full day of conferencing, that means you shouldn't. Don't force yourself because you'll be ineffective. If you're an extrovert and you're like, oh, I should go to bed, I shouldn't go hang out with everyone until late because it's not responsible of me. No, you should because that energizes you. So notice what you want to do, what your inclination is, and follow that as opposed to saying, this is what I should do. Now, introverts often think that extroverts have it all wrapped up for networking because think about what their strengths are. They like to energize around other people. They prefer a lot of action, so they must be better networkers. So I want to address that also. Just because you like going to networking events doesn't necessarily mean that you're a great networker. You might be, but it's not a direct correlation. If you're good at working in a room and can talk to a lot of people, what that means is that you're good at working in a room and can talk to a lot of people. When we go back to what real networking is building lasting, meaningful connections, one person at a time. So really the question about what makes someone a great networker is what happens after the networking event, the next day. Do you follow up? Do you have a meaningful follow-up? Do you just send an email blast to everybody whose card you received? What comes of the networking event? That is what determines whether or not you're good at networking. People say, oh, I love networking. Sometimes what they mean is, I love meeting new people and going to an event with a lot of action and talking, and that's exciting, and that's great. It's good that you love it. However, in terms of whether or not you are an effective networker, it's follow-up. Because if you're not following up, you're not networking. Now, introverts, you may think, well, gosh, we're doomed because I'm lucky if I talk to one person in an event. And that's true. You may just talk to one person in an event. However, if you have a meaningful conversation and the next day you send that person a nice email and you had a true connection and you reference the conversation and it's authentic, that could very easily lead to a lasting relationship. Now I'm going to confess here. I'm going to confide in you something about myself, and then I'm going to tell you why I really don't want to confide in you, and then I'll say why I did anyway. So here's my confession. I am an off-the-chart introvert. So I know some of you are watching this going, no way, look at her, she speaks to people, she has energy. Remember, that has nothing to do with whether or not you're an introvert or an extrovert. The reason why I don't want to tell you that is because I'm an introvert, so I'm private. However, it's important for me to tell you that anyway, to break stereotypes, because introverts can be competent, smart, upbeat, whatever you are, or whatever other introverts are. It simply means that we energize alone, that we work better one-on-one, and that we go deep instead of wide. So I don't want you to think that introversion is someone who isn't capable of being effective in their field. With that said, in terms of honoring your strength, you'll be more effective as an introvert or a centrovert or an extrovert by getting your energy where you need it. So you'll be better when you're networking if you go to fewer events if you're an introvert, if you stay a shorter length of time. So let's talk about networking in terms of what it really is, because it takes place in two different ways. For better or for worse, life is a networking event. So anywhere you go, anyone you meet, any place you're sitting or standing is potentially a networking opportunity. Some people think that's wonderful. Some people, it makes them want to run and hide. Now, for introverts and extroverts, your first reaction may be, oh no, that means I'm never off the hook. I can never go anywhere because I'm always networking. On the other hand, remember, you're the same people that often don't like networking events, and so it's okay to think that you can just meet people wherever you are. The other way to network is actual networking events, like conferences or meetings, and that's where a lot of business networking takes place. So let's think about how you can be effective in those situations. First, I want to ask you another question. Take a moment. I'm going to give you a little more time for this one because it takes a lot of thought. What are your networking challenges? What's hardest for you? And let's hear some of your responses, and then we'll take it to the next step.
Hi, Devora.
Hi.
Hi. So we have about 10 people saying approaching and icebreaking, how to start up the conversation.
Okay.
We've got 1 or 2 people a bit wary of self-promotion.
Okay.
Idle conversation is a fear.
Idle conversation?
Idle, yeah. And
Okay.
following up with the person you've been networking with, having phone interviews or chatting to them afterwards.
Okay.
Getting a deep connection with people, it can be a challenge for some of them.
You said a deep connection?
Yeah, getting a deep connection.
The first one was that about 10 people said, you said
was about approaching people and
approaching
icebreaking. What's the initial topic they should go in with? Specifically, I have one question on what question should you go in with if you are at a networking event for careers and with employers?
Great. So I'm going to, with careers?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to recap what I heard you say. Let me know if I left anything out. Approaching people and icebreaking, self-promotion, idle conversation, follow-up, deeper connections, and questions to ask.
Yes. Yeah, that's pretty much everything.
Super. Okay. Great. Thank you, everyone. Those are great questions. So I'm going to run through those, and then we'll go back to some context about how to network according to your strengths. Approaching people. I would guess those questions came more from the introverts and the extroverts, even though you may not know exactly what you are yet because I haven't taken the survey, but you might have an idea based on the explanations I gave. And because the extroverts really are mostly comfortable approaching people. Often when people say icebreaking or approaching people, what you're thinking of, the context you're asking this question generally is you're at an event, people are in conversations, how do you walk up to someone or a group of people and introduce yourself and approach them? Here's the answer. If that is something that is unappealing to you, then put yourself in situations where you can meet people without doing that. Because let's say you hate networking, so you go to a big event and you, of course, don't like it, so you arrive a little late. Big mistake. We'll talk about that in a minute. So you get there and you walk in and everyone seems to be in conversation and it's noisy and you feel like you need to break in or break the ice or approach people and you just want to leave. That is not your strength. So what I suggest instead, and it sounds counterintuitive, is if you hate networking events, get there early. Don't get there late because what you're walking into is exactly the situation that doesn't work for you. A loud, noisy room full of all these people that you need to approach that you are not comfortable walking up to a group of strangers interrupting their conversation. So set yourself up for success. If you get there early, not that many people get to networking events right on time. There'll be a handful of people. It's a quiet room. People are not already in conversation. It's more casual. People, 3 or 4 of you that are there can just naturally start talking to each other. And then leave after 45 minutes. Even if you're having a good time, say, I'm only allowed to stay for this long and get there early. That's one thing. Another thing to do, which is fantastic, so if you don't like approaching people and you feel awkward and a lot of those other questions too that you asked, is to volunteer as much as possible at networking events. There are so many reasons why this is a great networking strategy. Many people don't like networking events because they don't know what to say to people. And introverts in particular do better with a defined role in a situation. So introverts are good teachers, facilitators. They like having a role. If you're just wandering aimlessly through a room with platters of cheese, you don't have a role and you don't know what to do with yourself. So if you volunteer, you have a defined role. If you're the person giving out name tags, or you're the person greeting people, then you're more comfortable and it's easier to meet people. And it gives you something to do, and it gives you something to say. And it positions you as somebody helpful because you volunteered. So that's a great strategy. Let's say you get to an event and it was too late, you didn't volunteer. See what you can do to be helpful to people. So occupy yourself making yourself useful. If the planner's there, what can I do to help? Again, it positions you as someone helpful, and it gives you something to do. And we'll talk more about other ways to talk to people in a few minutes. Self-promotion. This is another one about working with your strengths. So I have 2 pieces of advice about this. Well, 3 really. Extroverts are naturally pretty good at self-promotion. You're okay talking about yourself, so it's probably not a question that you asked. Introverts are very uncomfortable with it most of the time. So instead of telling me how great you are and how fascinating you are and how amusing you are, instead, introverts are generally good listeners and good at picking up on cues of other people, often better at listening than self-promotion. So listen to what people say, ask well-formed questions, show a genuine interest. And this does a few things for you. One is, instead of promoting yourself through words, through telling me about yourself, I decide that I like you because you show what seems to be a genuine interest in me, and that tells me a lot about your character and your personality, more than you telling me about it yourself because I've reached my own conclusion. People really, it's rare to be really listened to, so if you can hone that skill that you're already good at, listening to people, then not only do I decide I like you, but you don't have to self-promote in the traditional way. And you don't have to think of things to talk about on your own because you're just asking me questions and learning about me. Now here's where that can potentially backfire. If this goes on too long, then it can seem one-sided to the person you're talking to. So you have to, now a lot of things seem private to introverts. So they don't only talk about what they consider personal things, and almost everything seems personal to an introvert. So before an event, plan out a few things that you might be comfortable talking about for yourself and be prepared so that it's not a completely one-sided conversation. The third piece of advice I have around self-promotion is it is useful, whether you're an introvert, an extrovert, or a centrovert, to have what's commonly called an elevator speech. And that gets its name from if you are in the elevator going up to the top floor and you suddenly find yourself with someone senior in a company or someone, or the speaker, or someone you want to meet, and they say, oh hi, tell me about yourself. And you have 20 seconds or 30 seconds to answer in the elevator. Do you blow that opportunity, or does it turn into a relationship? And in fact, surprisingly maybe, I've heard real-life examples of this happening to people in elevators or other similar situations where they've either made the most of it or not. In my book, I actually walk you through how to create an elevator speech and how to practice it and how to make it meaningful. It's surprising how few people, when put on the spot, know what to say about themselves in 20 seconds or 30 seconds. So that's a very important skill to develop that you can work on. Next, idle conversation. Don't have idle conversation. So if you're not good at it, and this is going to segue into a three-part strategy that is differentiated between introverts and extroverts. I'm actually going to address that in a minute. Follow-up I'm also going to get to in a few minutes. So making deeper connections. This I really think comes from less is more, talking to fewer people in more depth at networking events and asking things about them that are of interest to you. So this also ties into what kinds of questions you ask at a networking event. I know there was a separate question about questions to ask when you're interviewing for a career, so we'll talk about them separately. So if you're at a networking event, think in advance, what are interesting questions to ask that I'm genuinely interested in the answer to? Because a lot of us fall back into the typical boring questions like, oh, what do you do? Or where are you from? And it's not that stimulating. And plus it gets kind of dry. So by simple shifts in questions, it can totally change the conversation and make deeper connections. For example, instead of saying, what do you do? Try saying, what's your favorite part of your work? That will light the other person up. And generally, the favorite part of your work is something that you're good at or proud of, so it gives them a chance to shine, and it makes the conversation much more interesting. And also in my book, I have a lot more examples like that. Let's take a moment and talk about the 3 Ps. This is something I talk about, the 3 Ps, the letter P, a 3P strategy for introverts and extroverts in terms of networking. So the first step is, the first P for introverts is pause, and the first P for extroverts is patter. So the first step in networking for extroverts, patter means to talk, is do what you do best. Chat with people, talk, make other people feel comfortable. Extroverts are great because they can find this other extroverts or centroverts or introverts and talk and pull people in. You're the ones that are great at going up to people at events. So you are comfortable and happy, and it brings out the best in you, and you pull people into the conversation, so you're doing a service to them as well. So for you, the first step is to patter, is to talk. For introverts, the first step is the opposite. It's to pause. It's to take a moment before you start, and this ties into thinking to talk or talking to think. Extroverts talk to think, so for them, they get into things by talking. Introverts think to talk. So pause. When you get to an event, take a moment to yourself. Get focused. Get centered. The next step for extroverts is promote, and for introverts, it's plan. So extroverts can promote themselves. They can learn about other people. They can promote their friends at the event. They're good at that kind of thing, too. I mean, a great way to network is to connect other people. I do that a lot at events, and hopefully you do, too, where promote your friends, introduce people, and extroverts in particular are gifted at that. For introverts, it's to plan a situation that's going to work in your favor. For example, if you're at a conference and you don't like those big, huge dinners with a million people, plan and instead invite one person to have one dinner with you or a coffee or a drink. Do what you do best. And this strategy ties into whether you energize one-on-one or you energize with others. Put yourself in a situation that works for you. The third strategy for extroverts is party, and for introverts is pace. So for extroverts, you have a good time at these events, so enjoy yourself. If you are at a conference, it's more than just one day. Go out, have a blast. That's where you shine, and you're good at energizing people and making events upbeat, so do that. For introverts, pace yourself. Don't go to the whole event. Don't go to every meeting at a conference. Make it okay to have little timeouts while you're at the event. And so it's different strategies for different people. One size does not fit all. The question I'm often asked is, okay, so what about when I'm talking to someone else? I just met them. How do I know if they're an introvert or an extrovert or a centrovert? At first, you don't. So because you don't, you want to, for example, ask general questions and get cues from them about what they're comfortable answering. So some people think, oh, it's great, ask them about their family. Not everyone's comfortable talking about their family. And so ask general questions, and you'll get a cue, a clue about whether someone's more introverted or extroverted by how much detail they go into. Extroverts often, especially strong extroverts, will very quickly go into a lot of personal detail. Introverts will be more general. So take the cue from that person to find out what they're comfortable with. Now, the funny thing about introverts is that when they do feel a real connection with someone, they become quite talkative. So once an introvert feels a deeper connection with someone, it's pretty funny because they look like an extrovert. And if you had to guess which group of people will kind of hang on to you and not let you go at a networking event, it's the introverts, not the extroverts. The extroverts are into walking around and working the room and having a good time and don't want to stick with one person. But an introvert can be quite clingy if they meet someone they like in an event because they're like, thank goodness I met someone I like. I don't want to go back off to that big crowd, and they want to stick around with that person. So introverts, I'm sorry to tell you, you have to be disciplined and let that person go after about 10 minutes or 15 minutes back into the event, even though you were enjoying being with them. This ties into two more points. One is when you are at a networking event and you are talking to someone, I'm very frequently asked, how do you end a conversation? It is so easy, much easier than you think. Now, I do give a holistic question of enders in my book. However, two of my favorites are, well, it's been great talking with you. I promised myself I'd circulate, or I promised myself I'd meet other people, which is completely understood. And the other person is probably glad that you're letting them go because they also want to meet other people. Another way to end it is, I'm sure you want to meet some more people. Do you have a card? So it's saying, I'm sure that you want to leave. And do that before the conversation gets dragged out. So end it when you're still enjoying each other, and the tone you say it in, having a pleasant expression on your face, makes it really, really okay to end a conversation like that. Something else to think about in networking and in communicating in general is many people believe in the golden rule, which is defined different ways. In a nutshell, the golden rule is treat others how you want to be treated. And that seems like it would make sense, treat others how you want to be treated. However, once you really understand the differences between introverts and extroverts and centroverts, you realize that not everyone wants to be treated the way you want to be treated. And if I go up to you, if I'm an extrovert and I am talking and asking a lot of personal questions, that's how I want to be treated, that makes me comfortable, it may backfire on you. In my efforts to build rapport with you, I can do quite the opposite. So in my book, I talk about the platinum rule, which is treat others how they want to be treated. And this is much harder, and it's also more effective. So it's very difficult at first because you have to train yourself to pick up on these little cues and clues about whether someone's more introverted or extroverted. And you won't always be right, but you'll work on it. And then once you start getting the cues, you can, what I call, flex your style to meet other people where they're at. So even if I'm an extrovert, I can flex my style to make an introvert comfortable. These are difficult challenges. However, the things to work towards, and I go into more detail in the book. However, I just want to mention it. Okay. This goes back to also follow-up, which was another question that was asked. The reason why it ties in is because in order to have meaningful follow-up, it needs to start while you're there at the event. We tend to overestimate our own memories. I meet you at an event, I think you're charming and great, we hit it off, we have a good laugh, and I think, oh, we're going to, of course, remember each other and this will be great. We forget 50% of what we hear within 48 hours. So even though I think you're great and I get your card, 2 days later, I look at this card, I don't know who you are, I don't know where I got this card from, and I lost the connection. I'm not being a good networker. So at the event, when you meet someone you want to follow up with, and you may not want to follow up with everyone, then take their card. And this is great for introverts because it gives you a few minutes off by yourself. Get a pen out and write a couple points about that person on the front of that person's business card. If they have a hard to pronounce name, how to pronounce it. If they have an interest or a hobby. If you thought of an article you want to send them based on something they're working on. Whatever it is, a couple of things. And then when you see the card, it triggers you. And then your follow-up is also much more meaningful. Because instead of saying, oh, it's great meeting you, let's have coffee sometime, which is inauthentic, it makes me think, oh, you sent that to everyone. If you say, oh, I sent you this article because it sounds like it'd be perfect for the project you're working on. I hope you had a great hike on Sunday that you told me about, or whatever it is. I'm like, wow, this is really impressive. And I'm much more likely to follow up, and that's a great way to build deeper connections, which was another question. So follow-up and deeper connections are linked. Another question that was asked was questions to ask, like, for example, careers and job search. I think that means if you're interviewing or you're doing an informational interview. What really is important in terms of questions to ask is that you've done your research and that in advance you have figured out, learned about either whether it's a school or a job or an internship or whatever it is, that I know that you are not just generically looking for a job and just any job will do, but that you really want to work for my company and you know about my company. So research it and find out questions and show that you have knowledge of my company and what's unique about us and why we're a great fit, and that will be very impressive to me. So make the questions specific. And likewise, even when you're just meeting with people, especially if you're an introvert or extrovert, it can be overwhelming when you're looking for a job because you think you have to just meet so many people. Less, again, can really be more when you are doing your research in advance and following the 3 Ps for introverts, like planning in advance. I'm going to give a personal story about this. Before my first book was published, I was at a conference, and it was in my field of training and development, and there were about 40 publishers in attendance as well in the expo center where the booths were all set up. Common wisdom would say, get to all 40 booths and make sure they all know who you are, and maybe one of them will publish your book because it increases the odds and more is more. Being the introvert that I am, I did the opposite. I researched in advance about the different publishers, and I found one that I thought was the perfect fit for me. I made one appointment, one. I'm going to actually back up after the story and tell you how I got that one appointment because that wasn't so easy either. And when I met with him, he said he would give me 15 minutes of his time because publishers are always just being clamored on by so many people. And in the end, we talked for almost 2 hours, and I was the only person in the conference they signed, and he knew it was a perfect fit too. So when you do research and you're authentic, and he couldn't believe how much I knew about the publisher, then you can actually get away with doing a lot less. So here's another good networking story, which is the beginning part of the story I just told you. At this conference, I had no connections. Of course, I was a volunteer because I follow my own advice, and I was wanting to meet someone. I didn't know anyone in the publishing world, but so did everyone else at the conference. So there was a guy who was the head of the bookstore section and head of the conference. So everyone, of course, wanted his time, and everyone wanted something from him. This is another important tip of networking. Think of what you can do for other people, not what they can do for you. So I stood off to the side and observed him, and he was working in one of those, maybe you've been in these big conference centers where it's like bad coffee and no fresh air, and they go on for miles, and you're all inside all day. And I was watching him, and I thought, and he was being bombarded nonstop. I bet he would love a real cup of coffee, like a good cup of coffee, not like the stuff they have at these conferences. So I walked up to him, I'm a stranger, and I said, hi, I'm Devora Zack, and how can I get you a cup of coffee from, a good cup of coffee? Of course, he's like, no, I mean, what's he going to say? He's like, oh, no, thank you, that's fine. So he shot me down, and I said, okay, if you were to drink coffee, what's your favorite kind of coffee? How do you take it? So he answered my question. I bolted out of that conference center. I ran to the nearest cafe. I came back with this big, perfect cup of coffee, And I handed it to him. And when he saw it, it was like the nicest thing anyone had ever done for him. He was so happy. And he said, let's sit down and talk while I drink my coffee. I was prepared with my elevator speech and my proposal. We talked for 15 minutes, and he said, tomorrow I'll introduce you to any publishers you want. And, by the way, we're still good friends. He and I are good friends now. So that's a little networking story example. Let me pause for a minute and get some general questions from you before I give some more specific advice about how to be at a networking event. So any questions you want? Any questions at all about networking?
Hi, Devora. We have one question, which sounds like it may have come from an extrovert, but I'm not sure. How do you how do you prioritize the events you should go to? How do you find the time if you enjoy going to networking events?
Great. Good question, and it could be whether you enjoy it or not. So this is a great question for everybody. First of all, I like the way the question was phrased because it said, how do you prioritize and how do you find the time? So in the question is partly the answer. Yes, prioritize networking events. I am really dismayed by when I hear from people, oh, I went to a networking lecture from an expert, and he said we should go to a minimum of 3 events a week. I'm like, I'm so sorry he said that. That is not good advice. So yes, prioritize. Because even if you enjoy the events, it's still a drain on your time. And you, especially for extroverts, a challenge you have is you can be overwhelmed with follow-up. I mean, you're the ones that collect more cards, meet more people. It becomes too much. So the way to prioritize is to go to events that are inherently interesting to you. This goes back to the should thing. If you think, oh, I should go to this one, but it's not really that interesting to you, I say don't go. I say go to something that sounds like it has an appeal to you. Now, some networking events are just networking events. And for extroverts, that's fine. Generally, for introverts, they don't like those so much. A lot of networking events have other things going on. There might be a speaker. It might be a tasting. It might be a book signing. It might be an art gallery. Often networking events have a theme to them. So find a theme that you're actually interested in, or with a speaker you're interested in, or with a setting that you think sounds lovely. And then you're going to go more interested, and you'll be more on because it's something that already excites you and is up your alley, and you'll get something out of it regardless of the networking. So go to something that's inherently interesting to you, and don't drain all your time and energy. Something else is that this question made me think of is that networking events are often after work, and whether you pay to go or not, because I was going to say also if you have to pay for networking events, it can also get quite expensive. Many of them do have a fee. And then something else that happens when you pay to go to a networking event is they often have food and drink, and you think, well, I paid for it. I want to make the most of that. I'm going to eat my dinner there or eat or drink as much as possible because I want to get my money's worth. This is a common mistake. So my rule of thumb is eat before, drink after. Now there's a little bit of wiggle room in this. When I say eat before, it doesn't mean you can't eat anything at the event, but eat something before so you don't arrive starving. Because if you arrive starving, you think, or you just think I'm going to make the most and eat as much as possible because I paid for it, then there's a lot of chances things go wrong if you're overeating. You can get food in your teeth, you can spill, you can have food in your mouth when someone's talking to you. So in a lot, you can have try to avoid stuff that gives you bad breath. Like just the less you eat the event, the easier it is. Or eat simple things like carrot sticks so that you're not focusing on the food as much. And drink after. Some people ask me, surprisingly often, well, I'm more comfortable and relaxed when I drink alcohol, so is it okay to drink? One drink is okay, but don't go too much further than that. You can drink afterwards to celebrate if you like to drink, but more mistakes happen than good things when people drink too much. Other questions?
Great, thanks for that answer, Devora. A slightly different question. How about networking in an online context?
So
how do you become successful at it? What are your tips for it?
Okay.
Are there certain forums online that are better for networking?
So this is evolving all the time, and it really depends on what your goals are and what your profession is in terms of what's best, like which forum. I'm going to just give LinkedIn as an example because it's a well-known one. People use them differently, and introverts and extroverts use them differently and also have different challenges with them. So first of all, I will say that if you're going to be in various online forums, I say to minimize how many you're in because it's hard to keep up with all of them. So if you're in LinkedIn or Facebook or whatever else you're on, well, Facebook is often used for more personal networking unless it's a business Facebook page. So for online networking, don't join everything. And introverts tend to have smaller groups of friends or connections. Extroverts tend to have many more, and typically. And so it's quite a different experience then if you have a few people versus a lot of people in your network. The reason why it's so different is because introverts who have fewer people generally, they actually know those people and have real interactions and real connections with them. Often extroverts who have a lot of connections don't really know who all their connections are, don't know who most of their connections are. They met them at an event, but they haven't kept in touch. So you want to think, what are my goals? If your goal is to have a large network that you can tell things about or do promotion to, then that's fine. If you want people in your network to be people that will really rally for you or that are more personal relationships, then just limit it to people that you have real personal connections to or professional connections to. Extroverts, because they're extroverted and because they talk to think, that also means sometimes they write to think and sometimes do a lot of postings. So that's something I would caution against, not to do too many postings, because then you can start to kind of become a pest and people may take you off if you're talking too much about what's going on with you. In terms of a photograph, and this is something introverts don't like to put their photo on, it's like, oh, that's personal. I do think it's important in professional settings to have a professional photo on your page, because otherwise it seems like you're hiding something or you don't have a picture. So I think it's important to have your picture up there. And one last thing about online networking. It's good for some things, however, it does not replace face-to-face networking. Because it's so easy to promote yourself to a lot of people at the click of a button, or to send a resume at the click of a button. It's easy for you, that means it's easy for everybody else too. So there's a saturation, and it tends to be less personal. Still, most jobs are made through one-on-one informal interactions where people just like each other and make a connection, and it goes from there. So it is not a substitute for face-to-face networking, and that's a challenge that introverts have. They sometimes think, oh, I do my little online thing from the privacy of my room, and that's my networking. It's not. You still need to meet people face-to-face.
Great. Thanks for that, Devora. We have another question about what do you think is the basic purpose of networking? Why do you go to these events if you're already well-connected, you're busy, you're not looking for a job?
I like that question because a lot of people do say, well, I don't need to network. So think about a big goal you have in life, any kind of goal. It can be to go further in your career. It can be to undertake an artistic endeavor. It can be to make a personal relationship or connection. It can be to save the world through a nonprofit you work with. Think of a goal you have, what that really, really matters to you. Whatever your goal is, networking will further your aim. So if your goal is to learn about wine, or your goal is to write a book, or whatever it is, the more people that you have meaningful connections with, or the deeper connections you have with people, you'll have all these people, think of all these people as being coaches for you or cheerleaders. So especially, let's say you are, and I know this question was if you're not looking for a job, but just for a moment, if you are looking for a job, one challenge I hear is, and I notice, is that people, when they're looking for a job, particularly if they've been laid off or they've been looking for a job for a while, which is very, very common these days, they still feel a sense of shame around it and often want to hide the fact they're looking for a job. Quite the opposite is what you need to be doing, because anyone who knows that you're looking for a job becomes your mini job coach and your job searcher. I had a boss once who said, if I was looking for a job, I would find the highest mountain in town, stand out and yell, Thurman needs a job, and let everybody know. So if you're not looking for a job, and you're like, oh, I'm fine, still, you never know through meeting people how you might be helpful to each other in the future. So it's always helpful to network, and why it's important is because it ties into whatever your big goals are. Another question?
Thank you. Yep, we have another question. Where do you draw a line between professional and personal conversation? This may be a problem, obviously, with males and females, and if there's a different age gap, or if you're away on an international conference. This can sometimes become a challenge.
Yeah, I would err in the direction of keeping it very professional. So it really depends on the relationship, the background. However, if you're not sure, keep it professional. And if you're not comfortable with what's happening, depending on whether you're an extrovert or introvert, you'll handle that differently. However, I think that it's really important to keep it professional in a professional relationship, because anything else can really backfire. And there is a difference between a friend and a colleague, just like there's a difference between a boss and a coworker. And I think with rare exception, it's important to keep that separate.
Conversely, though, how do you turn a personal contact maybe into a professional contact if you think they would be good to work with?
Yeah, I like that, because really the subtext of that question is what I notice a lot is people are afraid to ask their friends about a professional help or helping them promote themselves. People in general are often afraid to ask for things because they think, oh, you know, I'm using that person, or it makes me uncomfortable. I think it's okay to ask. I really do. I see more people make the mistake of not asking than people asking, and in a way that's respectful. So I would say ask for, okay, so let's say you have a friend who works in a field that you want to go into. And say, can I take you out for coffee, and just for this half hour, I just want to really talk to you about your profession. So first of all, make it clear that you want to have a professional conversation, even if this person's a friend. And also, don't ask for too much. So it's not that, oh, can you get me a job interview? Make that clear. I just want to get some information. And let them decide how much further you can take it. Also, even if it's a friend, be prepared. And be professional in the conversation. Bring your resume, or show them some work you've done, and say, you know, if there's anything you can do to help. If not, I completely understand. So go ahead and ask, and let them either help you or not. If you don't ask, there's no way they can help you. And then softball it, and let them see that you're not pressuring them. And then we're going to be more likely to help you if you are more laid back about it. I see that. Since I've written a couple books, I get that a lot as a writer, because a lot of people want to write books, and people ask me all the time. And I'm happy to help, but it depends how much people really think you can do for them, and you can kind of get an idea of how subtle they are or how much you can help them. And make it as easy for other people to help you as possible. So don't say, oh, can you read this manuscript? So make it easy for them.
This leads into another question we've had. Obviously, you're American, you live in America, but you travel internationally. Would that work internationally? And in networking situations around the world, is it okay to be as forward as you're suggesting, or asking as many questions?
Okay, so I'm going to answer that in two ways. On the one hand, every culture has its own general style. So, for example, the way you do business in Japan is very different than the way you do business in the U.S. So it's definitely useful, especially if you're going to a culture that's quite different than your own, to learn about what's appropriate in the culture in terms of business and networking, because there are absolutely different cues that go on in different cultures. In some cultures, eye contact means one thing, and in some it means quite the opposite. In some cultures, you have to let the other person speak first. In some cultures, negotiation never is going to be closed until the last day of business. So it is important to calibrate the way you network according to the culture. When I toured Australia as a networking ambassador last summer, they had a very different style. They wanted the networking to be more irreverent and humorous, but also real and cut to the chase. So that's their style. And that's important. You're right. And what some cultures consider direct, other cultures think, why don't you just get cut to the chase? However, there's the other half of this. The breakdowns of introversion and extroversion is pretty much the same around the world. They're universal archetypes. The concept of introversion and extroversion comes from Carl Jung, and it's very consistent. I think that's actually why the book has been translated in so many languages, because it holds true for all cultures. It's just a matter of what it means to be direct or indirect in different cultures. Introverts and extroverts exist pretty evenly throughout the world.
Thanks, Devora. I think that's pretty much most of our questions. We just had one come in, and how would you approach the speaker of a conference? Which typical questions would you ask to that person?
The speaker at a conference?
Yeah.
I'm thinking about this because this happens to me all the time, and so I'm thinking about what works. It is, first of all, don't hesitate to approach the speaker at a conference. I think as someone who speaks a lot of conferences, it's lovely when people come up to me and say, oh, I liked it. And it does, if you're approaching the speaker of a conference because you want some one-on-one time, it definitely helps if you show background knowledge of that person. So sometimes people come up to me and say, oh, you know, I was wondering if you could teach me some networking tips. And, you know, I think, well, read the book. You know, it's like, it shows they really don't have much background. They saw that I was speaking at networking and they just wanted some one-on-one time. Other times people come up to me and say, oh, I love the example in the book where you say this, and I wanted to know more about that in terms of this context. And that's great when they show they really have an interest, they know who you are, and they have something specific to talk about. People do tend to sometimes go on too long, especially if there's a line of people that want to talk to the speaker. So I think that it's fine to approach a speaker if your goal is simply to meet the person and to get their card and to say, make some kind of connection, that's fine. If your goal is more to get some one-on-one time with the speaker, that's also okay as long as you can be very flexible and say, do you have 10 minutes or 15 minutes anytime during the conference, and let them decide or determine whether or not you can have a little bit more time. Generally, when that happens to me, I'm happy to do it. So I think other speakers would be similar in that respect.
Thank you for the answer to that final question, Devora, and thank you for your brilliant presentation. We've had lots of interaction with the audience, and I'm sure they've appreciated it. I'd like to let everyone know the recording of the webinar will be available afterwards. And if you'd like to get in touch with Devora, any questions will be directed through me. This is a CPD certified webinar, so you can collect your CPD points for this. And we hope to have you signing in next month on next month's webinar. And once again, thank you very much, Devora, for signing in from America.
Thank you. And just a quick plug, if you're a manager, my book coming out is Managing for People Who Hate Managing, and it takes another look at personalities. So I think you'll enjoy that as well. And let me know your success stories. I'm always interested to hear from people.
Great. Thank you. Goodbye from Amber. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.